The good news is that we've got lots of things going on. Uh, there was the prayer vigil for Section 14 on Sunday. There's the class yesterday, the class this morning, the class this afternoon at St. Paul's, the giving the sermon at the Methodist Church on Sunday, and on Shabbat, an in-person talk about the war in Gaza and Israel that is sponsored by the Chavurah, which will also be held at the Methodist Church. I don't think that's going to be live streamed. That would be my guess, but I'm not organizing it. So if somebody wants to find out, for those that are interested in participating from afar, you'll probably best to ask Stu Ortner, I'm guessing, or Mark Becker. Apologies to those that don't live in our area. A lot of stuff going on. In the meantime, the war, while the fighting, the actual troops inside of Gaza are fewer than they've been for this whole period. The bombing continues, as does the misery of the hostages and those struggling for their lives in the Gaza Strip. Things don't seem to be getting better at all. There was a terrorist attack earlier today outside of Jerusalem with one dead and many injured. It won't be the last, and even when there will be, God willing, a peace process of some sort that will lead to an independent Palestinian state, there will still be this kind of stuff, and any talk of it disappearing and people saying, see, we told you so, is just, it's not mature, it's not realistic. This is complicated business. And that complication is brought to Palm Springs this weekend, this Shabbat. I was made aware of the fact that a pro-Palestinian or a pro-Gaza from sea to the river, from the river to sea organization out of India will be marching in the Black History Month parade. There was a group of Jewish folks who are by and large liberal, very active in the Democratic Party here in the area, who wrote to the organizers either demanding, pleading, urging the organizers of Black History Month to not allow this group to march. Someone suggested, well, there should be a Jewish group that marches as well. When it got to my attention, my response, which ended up going into an email to a number of people, so this may get out as well, was that I don't think that we, who are not the organizers of Black History Month and not part of that committee and not part of that community, should be telling that community how to run their event. I think that's a really important thing, having to do with free speech. It's far more complicated, because what would happen if we were asked as a group of Jews who some wanted to march with Israeli flags? I would say that's inappropriate, but of course there would be outcries of anti-Semitism if we were asked not to march. I'm not saying this is a simple issue. What I'm saying is that, and excuse me to all those who are not from here and not from Palm Springs, but I don't want this to be, this is not the issue that needs to be in the headlines. This is not the issue that needs to be an issue. The issue needs to be coexistence, and the issue needs to be how we as Jews can support the African American and other people of color communities in our area to right the injustices of the past. And if they have decided that there is an intersectionality with a pro-Palestinian party for right now, we may not be comfortable with it, but that's not our choice. And the answer is to be there for them and not to boycott. The answer is to be present, to get active, to get involved, and with our personal relationships, try to change the situation, as difficult and as complicated as it might be. Okay, if any of this was too unclear, I'm sure this was rather unclear, then I would imagine things will come out at the conversation we have on Shabbat, on Saturday, which I have a feeling is at the same time as the parade. So you can't really go to both. That's my, while we're still in the war, introduction to today's study. Any comments or questions before we go on? Okay, I assume people are able to unmute if they need to. Yeah. Okay, we're going to continue today that which we began last week, which is this the kind of the peak in our second Isaiah that deals with the suffering servant. And you might remember that we last week we kind of left things open, and I of course need to get my sheet from last week. Sorry, just a second. A number of you mentioned that growing up as Christians, you couldn't imagine this chapter dealing with anything other than Jesus. We talked about the possibility or the stream in Jewish thought that this refers to the people of Israel. All the references to the servant referred to the people of Israel. In some cases, perhaps to Cyrus, but also to talk today about that stream of thought in Jewish interpretation, which totally embraces the interpretation that was used in Christianity, that this is talking about the Messiah. And so I think that's kind of our topic today, if that's all right. Please stop at any time with thoughts about last week, and of course, questions about this. Let's start with last week's page, which I hope went out. I think both pages should have gone out. If people don't have it and they don't have access to it, I can throw it up on the screen. Do people have access that want to have access to it? Or perhaps Madalena, you could put it in the chat box if you haven't already done so. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at everything today here. Chat. What's in the chat? So yeah, so the first link that went out, that's the one on the bottom in the chat, should be the document that we're looking at today, which is last week's document. And we're going to start with this rather strange story from the Babylonian Talmud. Let me see if I can do it without this. Too much noise. Oh, just a note, somebody mentioned, as if there were two different sources, Targum Jonathan and Targum Yonatan. They're the same. It's just that sometimes in some places people spell it Jonathan is the English for Yonatan, and it's the same Aramaic translation, which is not always a literal translation, but very often reflects rabbinic traditions about a particular passage. I think I mentioned that in the ancient synagogue 2,000 years ago, the Torah was read in Hebrew as it is read today, as is the prophets, the passages from the prophets, and those readings in Hebrew are actually not understood by most of the people because they don't speak Hebrew. Though the sages, those that had been schooled, could read Hebrew and understand Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic. That's what the people spoke, and so somebody who knew would simultaneously translate the Torah reading into Aramaic for the people to hear, and that was done in Aramaic in the land of Israel and in other places. The Pshita, which is from the kind of the northeast of the land of Israel, and was eventually incorporated into the Eastern Orthodox Church as a sacred text. Written in Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, also has its root in that. And in Alexandria, they translated the Torah into Greek because that's what the people spoke. Sometimes, in some places, the translation was literal, maybe even too literal. Other places, it was flexible enough, like the Targum Onkelos in the Babylonian tradition, the early time of the Talmud, where it was pretty pretty close to the literal text, except for when God is anthropomorphized. Then different language is taken. That's a difference in it, not a huge difference, but still. And then there are certain translations like the Targum Yonatan for the Torah, which is different than the Targum Yonatan for the prophets, or the Targum Neofiti, which is named after the room in the library in the Vatican where the manuscript is stored, or a number of other fragments of these kind of Targumim. They're very different kind of translations. They're translations which are embellished, laden with all sorts of material which is not in the text itself. And so what we see here in the examples that I brought on the page, there's two examples, is where Targum Yonatan adds the identification of the suffering servant as the Messiah. And what we're looking at today is a relatively early tradition in the Talmud. We know from the language itself and the personae who are mentioned in the story about the speculation as to, who is, what is, when is the Messiah. Okay, so Dan, would you read for us from the Babylonian Talmud, second half of the second page from last week?
Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said to Elijah, "When will the Messiah come?" Elijah said to him, "Go ask him." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked, "And where is he sitting?" Elijah said to him, "At the entrance of the city of Rome." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked him, "And what is his identifying sign by means of which I can recognize him?" Elijah answered, "He sits among the poor who suffer from illnesses." And all of them untie their bandages and tie them all at once. But the Messiah unties one bandage and ties one at a time. He says, "Perhaps I will be needed to serve to bring about the redemption. Therefore, I will never tie more than one bandage so that I will not be delayed." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi went to the Messiah. He said to the Messiah, "Greetings to you, my rabbi and my teacher." The Messiah said to him, "Greetings to you, Bar Levi." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said to him, "When will the master come?" The Messiah said to him, "Today." Sometime later, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi came to Elijah. Elijah said to him, "What did the Messiah say to you?" He said to Elijah that the Messiah said, "Greeting, shalom to you, Bar Levi." Okay. Elijah said to him, "He therefore guaranteed that you and your father will enter the world to come, as he greeted you with shalom." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said to Elijah, "The Messiah lied to me as he said to me, 'I'm coming today,' and he did not come." Elijah said to him that this is what he said to you. He said, "He will come today if you listen to his voice."
Quoting a verse from Psalm. So, any thought? First of all, is this a tradition that people have seen before? Is this a folk tale, a story that's familiar to anybody?
Yeah, that was a regular reading in some synagogues on high holidays, on Yom Kippur afternoon, the places I've been.
Okay, and what did you make of it then? What do you make of it now?
That we have to be ready in our minds at any time, and open to the possibilities of. I'm trying to avoid the word salvation and redemption, but that's what comes to mind.
And how about that last line there? Of course, he said he'll come till today. Today is correct, on the assumption that you pay attention to the psalm. Hayom im b'kolo tishma'u, right? Today, if indeed you listen to God's word. So, what do you say, Malka?
I just remember reading the psalm during the high holy days. And I really just thought, I don't know if it even relates. I just think about all traditions that I love about Elijah, the time traveler. That here he is, what they're talking about, at the seat of Rome, at the entrance of the city of Rome. So Elijah is apparently at the entrance of the city of Rome.
Right.
And where is he sitting? At the entrance? Just said Elijah can be anywhere that he's needed. Really, if
right, Elijah in the Jewish tradition, as I think most people know, is the harbinger of the Messiah, not the Messiah himself or themselves. He's the one who's going to announce it, and that comes out at the end of the book of
Malachi.
Malachi. Yeah, yeah. My guess is that Dan and Malka are familiar with this because it was printed in one of the commonly used prayer books for the high holidays. I'm guessing that's why these are the kind of stories that when people are looking to, for the material, for the people that are a little bit bored during prayers and when the cantor goes on and they want to look through the back of the book to see what might help them focus on something else. That would be one of them, or perhaps study opportunities. Yes, Megan.
When I've heard it, I've always thought that it means that still small Psalms, still small voice with it. The Messiah is within, and it's always there if you just listen.
Mm-hmm.
It's not it's a little metaphor for a person, but the last line is, if you listen within, it's there on a day-to-day basis.
Mm.
Yeah.
That voice of insight, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. A beautiful idea. What I would call a lovely midrash on this story. But to my mind, the simple meaning of this story is that the people themselves have the possibility of bringing the Messiah each and every day if they would only get their act together. I mean, this is kind of the Chabad reason for being, to get people, Jews that is, to do the 613 mitzvot symbolized by tefillin for men and candle lighting on Shabbat for women, and the 7 mitzvot, 7 commandments of the Noahide laws for the Gentiles. That's kind of, this is one of the things that motivates it, this idea that if the generation merits it in this very day, the Messiah could come, if only we, in this case Jews, would get our acts together. I brought it here though for a slightly different reason, and that is what's described about the Mashiach that he's doing every day with his wounds, his sores. I have a feeling this is taken right out of our chapter. This idea and this common thing out there in the Jewish world, that the Messiah is we don't know who exactly, but whoever he is, he's damaged, he's wounded, he's got sores, he's got bandages. And the difference between the Messiah and the other folk is that they do it all at one time. I'm not really sure the dynamics, the mechanics of how this works, exactly what they're doing to wrap and rewrap, to wash, whatever. But he's doing it because he wants to remain available for service. But he's got those sores. He's in trouble physically. And yeah. Anything else, Stephen? Are you familiar with this? Have you seen this story before?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So what are your reactions, if anything, or anybody?
Well, to be honest, I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around those sobering, the comments that you made earlier on, and just the complexity of your world and what's going on, and the reports of rising anti-Semitism, and just, it's just I'm troubled by all that, but also it resonates a bit with this text too. I mean, it helps. This text kind of takes me there in a way, with the just the suffering, just the whole Isaiah 52 and 53 idea of the servant who is to be a light to the nations. And that doesn't seem to me to be Cyrus per se. I mean, he plays a role, but the servant is Israel, or second Isaiah, or no question that the early church saw this as an anticipation of Jesus himself, but it's not necessarily predicting that. I mean, this is a universal theme, and in second Isaiah, it's clear that Yahweh is doing a new thing. This is unlike just the typical message from the prophets or the Psalms. This is the unsightly one, the one we all rejected, the one that we actually assaulted and oppressed, lo and behold, this is the one who turned his or her back and didn't strike back. And so that seems to open their eyes to recognize, whoa, this is God's doing. And so I'm kind of putting this from Yehoshua ben Levi, this text. I'm trying to make sense of the Messiah in those terms, the one who suffers, and yet, like in Psalm 118, the stumbling block becomes the cornerstone. Who would have thought it? That's a new thing. And again, the early church connected these dots, and that may have gotten hardened into an exclusivist way down the line. But I'm thinking here in the Babylonian Talmud, this idea of Messiah's, or as Jesus himself said, the kingdom is within, it's among you. And so this ending today, if you will listen to his voice, he's here. It's there's a presence. That's the complexity and the mystery, and trying to square that with the suffering and the violence that's heaped on to the servant who doesn't strike back. That's where my head is right now.
Yeah. So together with Megan on that idea of the inner part of it, there's another thing going on here, and I didn't bring it, but there's a in the Jewish environmentalist movement from the 70s onwards, there are these stock texts that everybody uses because the Torah texts don't have all that much. There's one verse in Deuteronomy that says you shouldn't cut down the fruit trees when you're besieging another nation. So there are not a lot of texts. So there's these few texts that became like everybody knew them, late 70s, 80s. And one of them was, if you're planting a tree and somebody comes by and says, come, Mashiach is coming, the Messiah is coming. What's the answer, Malka?
Just to keep planting.
Yeah. Finish planting the tree,
Right.
you'll get to the Messiah. There's this kind of humor, I think, that I don't know if it is a polemic, a very, lighthearted polemic against Christianity or not, or against all those that claim to be messiahs, but it's kind of, in the rabbinic world, it says, you know what, we have this world to deal with, right? Let's deal with this world. Let's not jump the gun. Let's finish what we need to do here. And there's a little bit here about this as well. In other words, it's not so magical. You can't just go find the guy and ask him. There's work to do. And I think what's common to all the comments I think that we made is that we all recognize there is work to do, and it's complicated. Yes, yeah, please, Wayne.
A couple questions. I'm going to show my lack of knowledge a little bit. First of all, what is the time of the Babylonian Talmud?
The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud itself was edited. It was a series of oral traditions. It's made up of it's made up of multiple layers, but two major layers. One layer was edited and written, that's called the Mishnah. It was edited and written, oral traditions that were written down and edited around 220 CE. On top of that, there continued to be conversations, discussions, debates about those traditions and other related traditions that became the corpus called the Babylonian Talmud, which was edited around 600. So the editing was late, but the literature that's in it spans 700 years. And I say 700 years because some of it is even from the 1st century BCE. And how do we date the material? One way of dating the material, which is in this huge work of running words without any punctuation in the traditional edition of it, you date it by looking at the kind of language that's used. If it's a certain kind of Hebrew, it means it's from the first generations, the first centuries of the Common Era, the same Hebrew as the Mishnah. Then if it's a certain kind of an Aramaic, it depends on who is mentioned, the places that are mentioned in it. So if the story's talking about Rome, it doesn't necessarily mean it was written at the same time. You know, but it feels like it, with the names that are mentioned and the language used, I would say this is probably from the first 2 centuries of the Common Era.
Well, my question, and I'm not as erudite as many of you on this study, but if I read this, which I did for the first time, I've never seen it, I would say, well, you know, the Messiah is really not coming. This is just sort of a maybe thing, and I'd be very discouraged reading this, thinking this is very, very general, doesn't speak a lot, and I'm speaking if I were Jewish, doesn't speak a lot to me about any any excitement about a Messiah coming, because even if he does, I'm not going to know it. Is that too off base?
No, not at all. I think it's a possible reading, certainly a legitimate reading of the text. It is part of those traditions that say, let's not talk too much about Messiah. When the Messiah comes, Messiah will come. But all this talking about, all this anticipation is not necessarily a good thing. I think there's a stream of that. There's a stream of thought like that in the rabbinic tradition. Yeah, so.
That's a question, Rabbi.
Yeah, Malka.
A few minutes ago, you said that the Messiah, with all the bandages, was going to be broken and wounded, and according to this passage. So I'm wondering, but in Jesus' time, one of the reasons that they didn't accept the Messiah, that Jews didn't accept Jesus as Messiah, is because he was wounded and broken. And maybe that's the reason that Rabbi Akiva and others could accept Bar Kokhba, because he came as a warrior and he came trying to get rid of Rome. So I'm wondering that if you have this passages that he's broken, why would we use that against Jesus being the Messiah?
Yeah,
And
I don't. No, I don't necessarily say this is against Jesus. That's not what I'm saying.
No, I'm not saying maybe it should be for. Because
right.
the passage here is saying that he's wounded and broken, and you said that according to this passage, he was wounded and broken.
Yeah, I think that's one of my major points in bringing this here, is that there are things in the air that bring us together. Are the commonality. What we're doing here is we're talking about our commonality, our common literary tradition, and also the differences, and trying to understand ourselves better by seeing the other, that is Christian or Jewish interpretation of the same text. We do that this Thursday afternoons in a different context as well. To me, this shows the commonality. There's this idea that the Mashiach is not a perfect person, right? Is a broken person, is a broken, bandaged person that comes out of the text in Isaiah. I think, the idea comes directly from our chapter in Isaiah. I'm sure. I'm actually sure of that. So it comes out from there, and then that aspect gives a blueprint or a template, if you will, for many of the stories about Jesus in the gospel. So not from the gospel, but from Acts, and this to me feels like this is gospelic, a gospelic, a kind of a tradition from Acts, as many of the stories in Acts felt like they were, as opposed to the epistles. So if we could go to the second page now, and please feel free at any time to say I still got something about the other piece, but if we could go through something we did together as a group a year and a half ago, towards the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, where there's this text here is while in the text from the Babylonian Talmud, our text in Isaiah wasn't quoted directly. I believe it was referred to in the bandaging thing. But let's take a look and see a different view of this. So how about Stephen Byrne? You want to?
You want Acts chapter 8, right?
Yeah, please.
Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Go south to the road, the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of which means Queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, "Go to the chariot and stay near it." Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. "Do you understand what you are reading?" Philip asked. "How can I," he said, "unless someone explains it to me?" So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. This is the passage of scripture the eunuch was reading. "He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" Then Philip began with that very passage of scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized?" Some manuscripts add, Philip said, "If you believe with all your heart, you may." The eunuch answered, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about preaching the gospel in all the towns until he reached Caesarea.
Okay. Comments?
What came to my mind was when it says that Philip started explaining to him. He's reading Isaiah and he's asking about it. I'm wondering, what did Philip say? And how long was that dialogue that they had going through all that?
You know, being me with what I just explained about Targum, when I first read this piece, when we were studying this together, I said, "Oh yeah, how could he? He doesn't know Hebrew. You know, he's sitting with kicking up with Hebrew." But actually, it makes more sense that he was reading it in Greek, and it's not that he didn't understand the word so much; he just didn't understand what it all meant, right? And what leads me to believe now that he was reading it in Greek and not in Hebrew, although this isn't definitive, is that this is not an exact quote from what we read in Isaiah. There's some additional material here, the line in bold, and that is how it appears in the Septuagint, the Greek translation. Now, that's not proof that he was reading Greek, because he could have been he could have had a Hebrew Bible in front of him that was reflective more of the Greek text as opposed to our Masoretic text. But that's not all that important. But so the question is, was he translating or was he explaining? It feels to me here that he was explaining, not just translating. And I guess the answer, I think, to your question is that little bit there that it says, "and told them the good news about Jesus." So I guess you want more details, Stephen, right? You want to know what exactly. Yeah. One thing is clear though, and that's why I left that extra paragraph that wasn't necessarily necessary, which was not necessary, is because the reading, the explanation led to action, led to deed. And in that way feels connected, at least in spirit, to the story from the rabbinic story as well, which talks about whatever it is, you've got to do something. You've got to do. If you listen to God's name, then the Mashiach will be here today. And here is that the reading from Isaiah in this way, defining exactly or explaining that this is Jesus, led to a deed. And the eunuch does something that day right away.
I do think it's telling that out of all the text from the Hebrew scriptures that Luke, Acts could have chosen, this is the text, right? And it seems to be addressing what I heard Malka open up was the scandal of the suffering servant. And and which scandalized the disciples, scandalized, everybody, it seems. And so this seems to be the vindication of that. And so when they get to water, and the eunuch says, look, what can stand in the way of my being baptized? Well, Deuteronomy 23:1 for starters, which says eunuchs are cut off from the covenant people. And I think the first century reader would have that sense or understand that. And so he is baptized, and so something happens, something new. The action does occur, and something shifts here. But wrestling with that scandal of the suffering piece is I think at the heart of this.
Dan, looks like something's percolating.
The word suffering triggers something. It's been on my mind a lot over the years. I never understood for a long time, many years, why or how there was such fervency about Christianity among Black people in this country. I didn't understand what the appeal of the religion of the oppressor was. Okay. And then I saw Steven Spielberg's movie Amistad, which I'll try to make this brief. A Spanish slave ship, its cargo mutinies off in the Gulf of Mexico. The ship winds up in beaching in, I guess, Alabama, and the question is what to do with these Black Africans. And so they're enslaved. And this is a true story, by the way. It happened in the 1840s. And so they're put in prison. And while they're in prison, somebody brings them picture books from the Bible with a very white, stereotypical Jesus. And Spielberg has these interned Africans pointing pictures and saying, he suffered like us. And that, to me, was in a nutshell, for the first time in life, the appeal of Christianity. So the suffering servant, to me, is key to understanding that appeal.
Can I answer to that?
Please,
Yeah, please.
yeah.
Oh, a couple things. One is that Black Americans, at least from the early years in 19th century, never accepted the Christianity of the slaveholders, lock, stock, and barrel. They continually transformed and transformed and transformed. That on one hand, they would say, okay, the slaveholder was standing there, and they would say one thing, but they say there are all these great poems that say, when they're talking about the Exodus, so the slaveholder wouldn't think that they were talking about their freedom. And the poem goes on to say, well, I'm a talking ancient, I ain't a talking about today. And then people like James Cone, this is in the 20th century, James Cone, Gaylord Wilmore, many others, that they saw in Jesus suffering the religion that Jesus was standing on the side of the oppressed. And that there's a great book that James Cone wrote, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, how he was equated the cross of Jesus with the lynching tree in the South. So they always took what they read, not always, but took what they read in the Bible and transformed it into their story.
Thank you, Malka. And from a Jewish African-American point of view, yeah. Jimmy?
Good. Yeah, I would hitchhike on what Malka just shared, but I would add that Stephen and I ironically were talking about the very thing yesterday at lunch. Briefly, we were talking about Pauline Christianity as opposed like Christianity of the suburbs being a little bit different than Christianity of the urban setting. And for this reason, in that we, all through my formative years, we identified more with Moses and the Hebrew scriptures than we did with the epistles of Paul.
Mm.
In other words, they would not be preached in our churches as much as the Exodus narrative and all of just the Hebrew scriptures in general. So I think there's a carryover to Stephen's point about how we see Jesus and see him a little bit differently. Howard Thurman wrote about that parallel between Jesus being in the oppressed minority at the time of Palestine, not one of the movers and shakers of the political system so much. So there was a natural affinity or a natural identification with that Jesus, the suffering servant, the oppressed, as opposed to the champion of the middle class fighting for political egalitarian rights and that kind of thing. So that's let me hitchhike, and that's about it. And it's my anniversary, so I'm going to have to peel off and spend some time with my wife, but I didn't want to miss. So
Mazel tov. Mazel tov.
all right.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. Wayne points out in the chat box that there's a PBS commentary called The Black Church that maybe we want to take a look at. Yeah.
That's a good comment. That's good.
Okay. All right. Harold, you want to read for us Matthew in number 2? We're looking at another case of where the gospel quotes Isaiah.
When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, the fever left her, and she got up and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were possessed with demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and cured all who were sick. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases.
My desire in bringing this particular text, because we have talked about the woundedness, the brokenness of Jesus, is one aspect of that is the imperfect, the broken, that that as opposed to the ruddy-cheeked redhead David or whoever the handsome hero might be. But the emphasis here is that it wasn't just stam, as we'd say in Hebrew. It wasn't stam shvira. It wasn't just plain old brokenness. It was brokenness and disease and hurt, which Jesus sucked out of or internalized, or whatever word we might use, from others. That Jesus was bearing those things. It wasn't just that he was deformed. It was just that he was sick. He was carrying that for others that may not come up. Certainly that didn't come up in the rabbinic text, I think. Care to give us a more Christian, authentic Christian theological interpretation, Stephen, on that one?
No, I think that thickens the soup a bit. And the question I have is, why is the suffering servant the access to becoming the light for Israel, for the people of God to become the light of the nations? What is it about the bottom-up approach that is the new thing in Second Isaiah, and that the New Testament, accents and develops? And the only hint I have for that, and going back to your comment, is the washing of their feet in the upper room, where he's trying to say, look, if you lord it over folks, you have to come from the bottom up, because the master oppresses. The master has power, and the best the master can achieve is compliance. But there's this sense that we can do better than that. So there's this nonviolent servant approach to the other that seems to be more effective in opening the heart, let's say, to facilitating connection and communion across all the usual divides. So that's my take.
So that's an encouraging and optimistic take as well, because it means that those of us who are looking to the Jesus story, those of us who are looking to the suffering servant, might be encouraged to make ourselves better in that way by absorbing the challenges of the other, and rising, everybody rising together. There's a cynical way of answering your question that you asked, and I'm not saying I necessarily, but this is kind of how I was trained, is that when your narrative as a people is that you're the chosen ones, and God has blessed you, and really only you, or certainly you more than others, and you're going to inherit the land, and you're going to build the land, and you're going to have a just society, and you're going to show everybody what it's made about, and you're in destruction, and everything has gone wrong, it's calamity, then one way to readjust your theology is to say, well, actually, this is how we're going to change the world, by being broken. That's more of a cynical way of looking at it. It's not as altruistic.
Or at least a more Nietzschean way, right?
Yeah. So I think there's probably truth in both of these approaches. Yeah. So let's look at something a little bit less suffering-like, with a little bit less seville, a little bit less suffering. And Richard, you want to read for us the verse from Ruth, and then Midrash Ruth Rabbah. And Wayne, Ruth Rabbah is from the Talmudic period, but my guess it would be mid first millennium. So let's just throw out there 500 CE, more or less, but containing material which is earlier. For instance, Ruth Rabbah was the first midrash that I was blown away in studying, and I realized that there was a passage that was exactly as the passage in Matthew, just in Hebrew letters, in Hebrew words, about don't take the cord from between your eyes. It's exactly in Ruth Rabbah. That's the first time that was my first in the early 80s to see that overlapping of rabbinic and New Testament material, but probably edited around 5th century. That would be my wild guess. Anyway, Richard, if you could read the 3 and 4. 3 is the verse that the 4 is commenting on.
At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here and partake of the bread, and dip your morsel in the vinegar." So she sat down beside the reapers. He handed her roasted grain, and she ate her full and had some left over. He is speaking of King Messiah. Come over, draw near to the throne, and partake of the bread. That is the bread of the kingdom. And dip your morsel in the vinegar. This refers to his chastisements, as it is said, but he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities.
And he put all that in the past, which I find a little bit more encouraging. But the idea of parsing out the verse in Isaiah to talk about Melech HaMashiach in the Jewish way, right? So this is not a Christian. I don't think anybody thinks this is influenced by Christianity. This is an independent, this is back to my point about the story in the Babylonian Talmud. These are independent traditions that grow, they're drinking from the same spring, literary spring of water. I don't think it's necessarily one's polemicizing with the other. Just think there are these natural ways of reading inspired by this wonderful, amazing text in Isaiah.
Do you think they were aware of each other's traditions, especially like in 500?
So 500 is when it was edited. This,
Right.
For that I need to figure if I don't know if it was ever published. There was a PhD dissertation of Ruth Rabbah when I was at Hebrew University. You'd have to see a critical edition to see what can be shown by parallels and wording and things like that. I remember at the time when I saw the other parallel in Ruth Rabbah. So first of all, these just might be really early traditions. I don't know how much there in some studies show an absolute blurred boundaries, like Annette Yashiko. That's part of her name. She has another last name. Shaul Magid, my teacher, my friend and teacher, his wife, she does a lot of work, and her students and colleagues do a lot of work on that very, very blurry boundary between Judaism and Christianity in the first few centuries of the Common Era. And that would be a question I would ask. I would ask her, although she deals with a lot more esoteric things. And it could be the answer to that is actually was clearly defined 100 years ago, Malka. You know, if we were to check it deeply, but I don't think so. I don't think this is. I really believe this is taking from. These are the examples that are taking from the same. Maybe they're in conversation with each other, but I don't think it's a polemic. The tendency when I was at Hebrew University was to see everything as a polemic. And I heard Annette once say at a lecture that that's kind of a man's way of looking at things. Everything is about a war, right? Maybe the woman's contribution to scholarship is that let's see how these things are conversing with each other and living, you know, these sometimes diametrically opposed truths. Is it about Jesus? Is it about a Jewish Messiah? They're not accepted by the Jews, are living in the same place. Yeah. Yeah, Harold.
I don't see the connection in the Midrash part. I don't see the connection between partaking of bread, dipping your morsel in the vinegar. What does that have to do with being wounded for transgressions?
So this is an allegorical interpretation, right? That you could say the same way. You know, what do the towers of Jerusalem have to do with the breasts of a woman? And yet that's how that's interpreted in Song of Songs, right? Allegory works that way, right? If you know where you want to go, you make everything mean something in that direction. And so it's not the simple meaning of the text. It doesn't purport to be. It's an allegorical interpretation because vinegar is something unpleasant. Right?
Okay.
It doesn't say, you know, dip your bread in, you know, delicious olive oil and za'atar, or, you know, crushed garlic and olive oil with some peppers on it, you know.
But it could have been balsamic vinegar.
It could have been balsamic vinegar. Indeed, it could have been.
Okay.
Well, and also, you know, when Jesus was on the cross, he was, you know, offered the vinegar.
Exactly, and again, I'm not sure that means that this is connected to that. So I guess that, you know, I'm sure in Strack-Billerback, where the scholars that 100 years ago put together this huge commentary that matches rabbinic references to things in not the entire New Testament literature, but a lot of certainly the Gospels. I would imagine that we would find this there. They often don't say what they usually don't say the connection though. The answers that you're looking for, Malka, they don't really talk about. They just show the similarity. Right. And but yeah, so yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons I brought that, Stephen, because of that similarity. Okay, so let's take another one from also mid first millennium. It's not as early as Psikta de Rav Kahana, which is thought to be 3rd, 4th century, and this is edited. This is a similar kind of midrash. It's based around the holidays, the special readings of the Torah, and not the weekly Torah portion. So, Arita Claire, would you like to read number 5 for us, please?
The Holy One brought forth the soul of the Messiah and said to him, "Are you willing to be created and to redeem my children after 6,000 years?" He replied, "I am." God replied, "If so, you must take upon yourself chastisements in order to wipe away their iniquity, as it is written, 'Surely our sicknesses he has carried.'" The Messiah answered, "I will take them upon me gladly."
The idea is mentioned here. It's not referred to, the chapter from Isaiah. I guess my only point here is that this idea lives on long after the separation of Christianity and Judaism. This is certainly a later one, and this is even if based on earlier material. So between Ruth Rabbah and Sikta Rabati, and it's not positioned as a polemic with, right? It hasn't happened yet. It's just there. There's this idea out there. It just shows you this is just some of the tradition that has been generated by our passage in Isaiah, in Second Isaiah. It's that important of a thing. We're not going to do it now, I think, but you can see another section from the Babylonian Talmud, this time from Sanhedrin, that deals with the different names. The most appropriate, the part of this which is connected to what we're doing is actually in the middle, where it says, and the rabbis say, the leper of the house of Rabbi Judah the Prince is his name. That's his name. The leper of the house of Judah the Prince. So go figure that out. I mean, it has to do with Judah the Prince being an aristocrat, claiming to be from the seed of David, probably expectations of some people in his time around 200, 210, 20 CE, expecting him to be the Messiah. There are lots of passages in rabbinic literature that talk about Messiah. So I mention this because very often people will ask me when we talk Jews and Christians together, is that it's hard for many Christians to understand there is thoughts of Messiah that are not Jesus, that are not about Jesus, right? What is so central and so overpowering in the Christian faith is one issue in the Jewish faith, Messianism, and totally different views, but lots of different options. And then if you'd like to get involved in little polemics, I brought Origen, who talks about his contact with a rabbi or rabbis on this particular issue. But I'll leave some room now, last few minutes, for some comments and summing up if people would like. And then I think we'll move on next week. Yes, Harold.
I just wanted to ask about in the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin section where it mentions Shiloh. And I think I was listening to an archaeologist talking the other day who said that Shiloh, which was not too far, just a few kilometers south of Shechem, and that Shiloh was kind of a center of cultic worship, or had been a center of cultic worship.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true to your knowledge?
Yeah, it is true, and it's also the name of a settlement, a West Bank settlement, that one of the earlier ones that has a particular strong Messianic Orthodox Zionist presence, the yeshiva. We actually have some relatives who are there, and some of this also because of that verse that's quoted here, Ad Shiavo Shiloh, or Shelah, is a really problematic verse. They tried to do something with it, so that's in the blessing of Jacob of his children before he dies. So yeah,
Isn't that in Genesis 2?
That's in 49.
Yeah, not 49. Before that, in the story of it says that when all of the descendants are killed, what's his name? I can't think of his name. Descendants are killed, and he takes the harlot. He mistakenly takes the harlot. He thinks she's a harlot, but it's really
Yehuda, right?
Yeah, and then he says something. Isn't there an expression unto Shiloh comes in that chapter?
Yes, yes, true. Because his name is Shelah, but if you read it differently, it's Shiloh, right? Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. It's not from. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, problematic. So we're obviously referring to a place that was a cultic center. Yeah. Anything else, Vice?
Yeah, David, I appreciate your effort to try and recognize the universal relevance that goes beyond the polemical, with the idea of the suffering servant. And again, going back to Daniel's comment about the Amistad, and it's like you're not most people aren't going to trust the master, or you'll comply. But I think something else is here, that when one comes to you as the other who's truly open and comes from, a place of nonviolent humbleness, then I think there's more of a chance for all humans to trust. And to me, that's the name of the game, regardless of the ideological notions behind any number of particular polls. So I appreciate that. Where we're not making the suffering servant, we're not marginalizing it as a Christian text. It's got wider application, seems to me.
Absolutely. Thank you. So for those of you who are in town this afternoon, we're relaunching our study group at St. Paul's, a local Episcopal church, with Reverend Dan Klein. We're teaching texts from the Hebrew Bible, which are central to Christianity. We're going to do a little bit of the Sermon on the Mount today, really just the part about an eye for an eye and turning the other cheek. And then we'll get into the biblical material and try to put that into context as well. Again, looking at the similarities, but at the changes, the differences. So God bless you, everybody, and let's look forward to a good Shabbat, a good weekend for all. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.